fraud, burglary, larceny, robbery, all of these are crimes. However, do you know what these words actually mean? While I've been doing this one-on-one series about prisons, in my unintentional sabbatical, I started to realize that a lot of people don't know what terms for crimes actually are. So today, let's walk through what is a crime, and then let's break down the different classifications of crimes and what they actually mean. So, what makes a crime a crime? Well, crime starts with laws, and laws are made up by our legislators, whether there are local city legislators or our state legislators or the ones that we hear so much about in the federal government. Those are the people who make the law. The House, the Senate, the city councils, these are the people who make the laws. Those laws get written, and then if you break the law, then you are committing a crime. Now, sometimes in the way that a law is written, or when someone breaks a law and feels like they haven't done so, or they may have broken the letter of the law but not the spirit of the law, it goes in front of a court and it will work its way through the system. And the judges can actually determine how the law should be interpreted or enforced. So when you hear about Supreme Court ruling on Roe v. Wade or reversing it, what's actually going on is that they're not making new law. What they're doing is that lower courts have been ruling on existing law, following their interpretations of it. Those interpretations are making their way up to the Supreme Court. So maybe a local, like a state court, has ruled on, the initial Roe v. Wade case. It was appealed, went to a federal court, and then made its way to the Supreme Court. Once it goes to the Supreme Court, whatever the Supreme Court rules on it, that then becomes the law for the country, depending on how they rule on it. There are some cases where the Supreme Court, well, one, they may not take the case. Two, they may take the case but say, well, this is a special case, but in most cases it would go in a different direction. Or they can outright say, nope, this is the policy, this is the law of the land, and as in the initial Roe v. Wade case, they had special conditions that applied for all states to follow, and that became the new interpretation of the law, which then determined whether or not someone was committing a crime. So, judges also help clarify the law, is the best way to look at it. When you go in front of a judge, whatever that ruling is, that then becomes the ruling for the next judge that they will go after and what lawyers will look at when they're fighting a case in the courtroom. They will pull from previous rulings to show that a person is or is not breaking the law. That's the judicial end. The final branch, of course, is the executive branch. This branch has no business writing laws, okay? In general, they're not supposed to. They are supposed to execute laws. And they are in charge of putting all of the implements in place, and the branch of government which is supposed to put together all of the commissions and work groups and organizations that are going to help execute all of the things that the legislative branch needs, or maybe even the judicial branch needs. However, as you may have heard, it is becoming ever more popular to use executive orders to basically make law out of whole cloth within the executive branch. Executive orders, however, they cannot conflict with any laws that the legislative branch has come up with, or any previous laws that the judicial branch has laid out. If it does, you are now creating a constitutional conflict. So that's when you get a case when people start suing the executive branch for doing something that is not constitutional or is going against previous law. And now you're dealing with the executive branch going to court and defending itself. As a general rule, the executive branch was not created to create laws. However, as we all know, it happens. It also doesn't happen well, and it causes a lot of conflict a lot of times when it does happen. This is totally bipartisan because it happens with either party, with whatever president does it. Most legislative branches do not appreciate executive orders. So there's that. However, the House and the Senate can decide to turn an executive order into law and then actually make it law for the country and make it permanent. A lot of times, executive orders will get overridden by the next president who comes in to power, where versus anything put into place by Congress has to be overridden by new legislation, which is much harder to get into place, which is intentional. Okay, that's laws, a breakdown. And then if you break one of those laws, even in an executive order in these cases, you are committing a crime. Okay, now crimes have a lot of different categories as well. There's misdemeanors and felonies, which are different levels of categories of crimes. And then even within felonies, depending on your state, depending whether they're federal or not, they'll have different classes within there. Usually it'll be something like class 1, class 2, class 3, or class A, class B, class C, something like that, that determines what type of felony. Usually if it's something like a class 1 felony will be more serious, have more serious penalties than a class 3 charge. The whole point of this is to help, the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony, and between a class 1 felony and a class 2 felony, is in part to differentiate what the punishments are going to be. Generally, a misdemeanor is going to be fines, maybe some classes, maybe points on your driver's license. For a felony, that's not the case. Once you get a felony, you're going to get basically a change in citizenship status. You can no longer legally own a gun. You can no longer travel to many countries outside the U.S., which is basically determined on those countries. Many countries will not accept you, including Canada, including Australia, I believe, including Germany and some other ones. So once you are a felon, that's a permanent thing that's not going to come undone unless you get a pardon. Between class 1, class 2, class 3, generally like a class 1 felony will have like the range of a sentence will start higher and have a higher limit. So like a class 3 felony might be like it's 0 to 20 years is a class 3 felony, whereas a class 1 felony might be 5 to 99 years as the potential punishment. So, and then there's also what the guys in prison would like to call alphabets, which include life in prison, death, those type of punishments as well, which can only be done if you have a certain, those serious classifications of felony, or if you have a capital charge, which usually means that you can either only is up for life in prison or the death penalty. So let's talk about fraud, shall we? Many people don't know that fraud is a crime. It's an actual legal term defining an actual crime. For me, and I think for most people right now, I think fraud is just kind of a synonym for lying. Okay? Oh, they committed fraud. It's kind of like, it's like business lying. basically. The thing is that that's not what fraud is. Fraud is a legal term for a type of crime that if you are caught doing, you can face criminal charges for. So here we go. What is the legal definition of fraud? Fraud: the intentional perversion of the truth for the purpose of inducing another person or other entity, in reliance upon it, to part with something of value or to surrender a legal right. That's fraud. So if you're doing that, if you're trying to trick someone to surrender something of value or to surrender a legal right, then you are committing fraud. There you go. So when someone says, hey, that person over there is committing fraud, all right, they better have the receipts. Otherwise, you're saying that someone is committing a crime, a felony level offense. Unless you have the receipts, unless you have some proof to back it up, you need to follow it up and say, like, these are what's going on. This is what's happening. And here's what I can say. If someone is saying that they have found fraud, that means they went in front of a judge or a jury, and that the fraud was proven. Because, in this country, you're innocent until proven guilty. So you can't just say that there was found fraud. Also, note on that for many of my listeners here, and also for one of my former co-hosts, you can't show fraud with a fancy dancy countdown meter. So you can't just have a website with a whole bunch of meters counting the amount of fraud. I mean, I could do that. You know what? Here. There's my countdown meter. Now, is it showing fraud? Is it showing something else? What is actually happening every time one of those things ticks? I don't know. Something. But remember, fraud is a legal term. So until it goes in front of a judge, until it goes in front of a jury, until there is an actual verdict, you can't count it. So you don't have the receipts until you have that verdict. And that's really easy paper to show, to get, and to hand to people and say, hey, we found the thing. Here it is. This is the judge, and this is the judge who ruled it and sentenced it. Here's the jury members who decided the verdict. We have it all there. So, FYI, anyone who's looking for fraud, that's where it is. Now, some other interesting things about crime. You've probably heard a lot of words about crime: murder, robbery, even some less familiar terms like larceny. But one you've probably heard a lot of is burglary. Now, just off the top of your head, what is a burglar? What does a burglar do? If you are caught red-handed in the middle of a burglary, what did you just get caught doing? I'm willing to bet what you're thinking is one thing, and what it actually is a different thing, because that's kind of what I thought. Burglary is the unlawful entry of a structure to commit a felony or theft. So, to be clear, burglary is not a theft. You can't commit a theft after you've committed burglary. What a burglar does is unlawfully enter a structure. Now, in many jurisdictions, the term burglary legally also changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some places, burglary only applies to private residences, and it only applies at night as well. So, seeing the Hamburglar in those striped pajamas has a very different meaning. So that's burglary. Okay, now let's go to robbery. What is robbery? Many people say armed robbery, but here's the thing with that. Robbery is always armed. When you're committing a robbery, you are always committing a theft while using a weapon. So you don't have to say armed. It's always armed when you're committing robbery. Now, you may be thinking of larceny, which is just general theft that is not armed and you're just taking money or property. But robbery is armed. Another one that definitely threw me for a loop for a while that you may not even think about is the term murder. So, for those of you who don't know, new to the podcast, hi, I'm Ryan slash Rainforest. And in 2014, I caused a car crash that ended up killing a young man. Uh, and for a long time, like, you know, as I'm taking responsibility, as I'm dealing with what had happened in my, depression over all of this and all of what had happened and trying to reconcile who I am after this event, uh, the term I would use for myself was a murderer because I had killed someone. However, what really I had done was manslaughter. The difference between manslaughter and murder is all about intent. Now, murderers have intent to kill someone, whereas if you commit manslaughter, there is no intent to kill someone. It was accidental. Now, there can be some caveats to that. In Texas and some other places, murder can also apply to someone if they killed someone, even unintentionally, while committing another crime. So, if in my case, instead of being drunk, if I had been fleeing the police at the time and then killed, ran into the other car and killed the young man, that would be murder because I was in the act of committing another crime. In some places, they don't have manslaughter, they just have degrees of murder. There's like murder 1, murder 2, and murder 2 is manslaughter, or murder 3 is manslaughter. And then there's also different degrees of what manslaughter is. And so in my case in Texas, there's felony manslaughter and there's misdemeanor manslaughter. If I had not been drunk at the time, then I would have been eligible for misdemeanor manslaughter. Also, if I had not used a vehicle. So if, let's say, instead of being behind the wheel of a car, if I had had a seizure and fell on a person and they had died during my seizure, that would have been a misdemeanor manslaughter. That could have been a misdemeanor manslaughter charge that would have applied as opposed to a felony, which again, this is all has to do with jurisdictions. Some places, alcohol, no alcohol may not make a difference at all. It may be a misdemeanor in some places, whether or not there's alcohol, and the presence of a vehicle may not make a difference. Sometimes what counts as a weapon is like an actual weapon, like a gun or a something that is commonly used as a weapon. Another thing, another point to bring up is that in Texas, there's actually another misdemeanor type of manslaughter called negligent endangerment. Negligent endangerment usually only applies to businesses or business owners who, like, let's say in my case, let's say instead of being behind the wheel, I had just built the road that everyone was driving on that night. I ignored all the safety regulations and it had collapsed and killed everyone who was driving on it that night. That would actually be negligent endangerment, not a felony. So that kept me up at night for a long time once I discovered that information. And now I've given it to you to think about. Negligent endangerment, manslaughter, murder, all differences. Different classifications of different crimes determine what type of penalties. So now, let's say you've just gotten arrested. You've got you're facing a serious felony, and you could potentially go away to prison for a long, long time. That's what we're going to talk about next episode. And we're going to talk about what that process looks like and how you can navigate it as a civilian to get yourself out of it and hopefully in one piece. So join me next time for that, and I'm looking forward to seeing you then.